I have a question, Laura. I've had a lot of experiences with, I guess the dead is the best word for them, right? From tarot clients to, cleaning houses, which is banishing, and I wonder if you would say that um, certain of the certain persons have a nest which is more developed than others, which makes them more present. Because I just think of, from when you go into a place and there's a scent, for example, to a more elaborate sort of encounter.
Honestly, I'd
Yeah,
be guessing. I'd be guessing. I don't know.
yeah. No, I mean, I know you'd be guessing, but I just wondered what your guess might be.
Can't do it. I'd be betraying myself if I was to tell you. If I was to make shit up, I might as well be an evangelical Christian.
Well, no, of course. Of course. I never know if it's us as receiving that we're more tuned in that moment, or if that ness is uh, more connected to us for whatever reason in that moment.
Before I moved to Melbourne, I took Helen for her birthday to one of the big cemetery in Melbourne. And we wandered through looking at the gravestones, wondering what had happened this year, wondering what had happened that year, particularly when you got a whole raft of deaths happening in the same year, like 1919, for example, 1920, when the so-called flu went through. And one of them was like the lessons, I think the teaching and the lessons that one gets from the lived experience, and everything else is speculation. The lived experience of this particular moment was seeing the gravestone. The grave was no bigger than 4 foot, and the stone, the headstone, was falling over. The name on the stone, oh, fuck me, it's like coming out, I've got to tell you, coming out of this little grave that was completely shattered was this massive juniper tree. She would have been 50, 60, 70 foot tall. The name on the gravestone was Valentino, was a child of 5. I looked at the stone, then I looked at the tree, and then I looked up. And I said, "Hello, Valentino." That best describes the experience of who he was, or who he is. Not who he was, but who he is. So he was named Valentino, but the transitional movement from sun and star and space beyond measure is very profound. And I think that what I know is I'm convincing myself of the beauty of living. Even recently, there's been massive mudslides taking place in, I think it was Pakistan. It could be Sri Lanka. Massive mudslide, buried hundreds of people. The deep grief that the living would experience the day of mourning, etc. And yet, what Earth needs to do is just kill a few people, the next generation and the generation of breeders after that. And it will happen with an epidemic. It will happen with the millions of people who died in World War One, the millions of people who died in World War Two. If we didn't have the dead, what the fuck would we be eating? We couldn't be here. We would have been inundated with people. You've almost all done Y-node theory, haven't you? Y-node theory puts on the spot the idea that we are an expanding species. Y-node theory suggests that we have been a huge species and that we are actually narrowing. The mathematical logic of Y-node theory is a mind fuck. And it's impossible to not understand life without understanding Y-node theory. It just spits in the face of everything that we're being told to do with an expanding population. We've had discussions about genealogy and what happens if there's 10 people in a family, if all those family members are wiped out. That doesn't mean there's not a third cousin from 2 or 3 or 4 generations beforehand who's been breeding. And so you are still here, no matter whether there's been a million of you dead. There was one who wasn't. And that one person's bred, and that person's you. And everybody here is the product of everybody, not only everybody who's been before you, but everything they've eaten. And everything that's touched their skin or been toxic or been sweet or been whatever we want to call it, the effects get taken up and taken in And so more than the idea of veils or the idea of passing over is the idea of passing in. The experience becomes who we are. The experience of the dead become who we are. And there's a process, like you could almost see it as a computer system of going, where the essence or the ness of who that person was is completely absorbed into our understanding. And quite often we've got to actually sit down and sort out what we truly feel about that person. Very often we'll deny what we felt. We might have hated them. And yet because they're dead, we are told, do not speak ill of the dead. Just don't speak of the dead. That's not them. Your ness is then expanded by who they are, which means, and the interesting thing about that idea of expansion is one could say the biggest fucking thing in the universe is every atom in your body, because you know what can be done with an atom, don't you? And how many atoms make up a human form? How many atoms make up a marmot, a weasel, an earthworm? All of these ideas of size being relative. I can remember coming back from Ireland and going across to Belongia Beach and standing there and looking at the sea, and there was all these people sunbathing. And I walked across to 100 feet away from where the tide line is. And I went, Mummy's home. And the water came up the beach. And it kept coming and coming and coming until it got to my toes. And there's people fucking screaming because their towels are getting drenched and they have no idea what's happening. And then the water receded again. And I could have felt anything, but what I felt there was how nothing's bigger. And that idea of compassion and communion became much more significant than the idea that the ocean is vast, because we get frightened by big things. If we don't think of them as bigger than us, we don't fear them, unless it's bacterial. Even we eat simple, and we think about our beasties, the beasties that make us us. There's the compassion. There's where the compassion needs to be. And if society could honor the work of nourishment and preparation for death by being nourishment, you'd never buy Pizza Hut pizza again as long as you fucking lived, because you wouldn't want to feed that shit to your dog, let alone your beasties. So it is a matter, and understanding that a beastie bacteria, like a retrovirus or an RNA or a DNA, when you've got an RNA that could be particles of a 1,000,000-year-old retrovirus, it's going to come up to the surface if there's a reason. Nobody necessarily knows what that's going to be. But when it's time, if there's a reason, we will have a Zika outbreak. And all these children will be born different. And then we'll have an outbreak of some other disorder until such time as we develop an evolution that fits in with what life wants, not what society says. Because life it's so mute, it's so silent. And because we don't hear the words, and we've been indoctrinated into thinking that words are more important than sensations, but we know it doesn't work that way. Every time I've lied in my life, I've known I'm lying. Every time I'm in the presence of somebody who's lying, I know they're lying. I'll fight to believe them. I'll fight what I know to believe them, no matter how much I care about them. But this here does all the talking. And so many people say you're gutsy. I've got a gut feeling. I've had a gutful. This understanding that our gut is who we are is part of that. And that birth and life and death is continuously going. And the nurse of you and you and you and you and you and you has to do with everything epigenetically that you've experienced. That the nurse of each of you is from vast forests of creatures, of other people. And so should we mourn? We need to mourn for who we are and our sensations of loss. But I don't think it's got anything to do with the dead. I think it's got to do with us, and we're not game enough to admit it. We suffer because we don't give it the right song or the right experience.
I've been seeing, experiencing, hearing the so-called dead for about 12 years myself. It started with presences in houses, especially rental properties. Sometimes other people saw the same being, and I thought, well, that's interesting. We're all seeing the same thing. I'm not saying anything, but people are describing it. And it started then with deceased family members. And I knew that it wasn't coming just from inside me because of the specific sort of jokes that they would make. And I thought, wow, that's really surprisingly funny. I couldn't have made that up. That's come from something else, someone else. And then it started happening in my astrology sessions as well, where a person might ask something and then the presence would jump in and either want to watch the session or have a say, have a voice. And so sort of part of my question is from a professional standpoint with astrology, tarot, things like that. How do I develop this better? But my question, so that's one question. And other question, my main question with things at the moment, as you know, I've had experiences with a couple of people close to me die quite recently. One of them was comatose before the death. One of them was a suicide. So in both cases, there's questions about what did that person think or feel when they were dying? What did they have to say? Things that haven't been said, questions that people have. And in one of those cases, a psychic's been called in, or someone's asked a psychic this and this and that, and someone else might think, oh, I'm not sure if that psychic's on it or not, which is what, then I thought, well, who would I ask? And I thought, well, maybe I'll ask Laura, whether you do that kind of work for people, whether people ask you to communicate with the dead, whether it's worth it or not, particularly if both deceased people have come to me. So that, well, I can communicate with them directly, but is it better to have someone objective, or is that just a societal notion that I've taken on that I need to have some objective third party discuss my intimate matters? And then the final question, which I'll just put in, is there have been quite a few people who've said recently of these two deaths.
Remember the ones you've already asked. So I'm Ali. Keep going.
A number of people have said about these two deaths, which are unexpected, and there's been 4 deaths in the last 4 months, and they've all been unexpected. And people say this is an untimely death. This is an untimely death. And in all cases, I've thought they feel pretty timely to me. Astrologically, they look perfect. They don't just look timely, they look perfect. There's a precision. And I suppose with tarot, it would also, there's a real sense that was the time. So I just wanted to put that out there. How do you feel about this sentiment of an untimely death and fate and
because
matters?
Several things. Thank you. Because this question has been one that I've been asking all my life. I do remember when no matter what else, quite astonishing book came out called The Seth Material. What I'm very aware of is what's missing from our literary shelves nowadays, because there's this plethora of repetition. The Seth Material was this woman, and she was, for lack of a better expression, channeling this entity called Seth. And this question of untimely death became part of what she was discussing. And she said this Seth person was very confused with the concept of an untimely death, because a 2-year-old dies and everybody goes into grief and mourning, says this should never have happened. But what this Seth said is this person was destined to die at 2. And in those first 2 years was everything that person was living for. Then, so that's called the Seth Material. That was very, very interesting. It's probably very dated now, but it's still an extraordinary series of theories and curiosities. Then there was Vince. Vince is there's a couple of them. Vince is a client that I'd seen 3 or 4 times. But I remember his name very clearly because of what happened. He came to see me after an event. And this is back when tapes were done. The event was the suicide of his cousin in Western Australia. At the age of 28, he had hung himself and he hadn't left a note. And there was no knowing why he had hung himself. He had a wife and 2 children. And Vince had a reading that said, someone in your family is going to kill himself. It was his time to die. He was always going to do it. It was his destiny. No one's to blame for anything. So if anybody wants to play blame games, they need to stop it because they're creating more harm. He's done what he came here for, end of it, talking in the present tense. So when Vince's cousin hung himself in Western Australia, Vince put the tape in his pocket and went across to the family who were all at each other, saying to his wife, his young wife, what happened? Why did he do this? What happened between you? Looking for a reason. And Vince went into the lounge room where everybody was, put the tape in the tape deck and played it. And there it was. A year before this had happened, it said, this is his destiny. Just being able to hear that, all the blame went. All the speculation went. For there to be a psychic who saw it beforehand and to understand that there was never any other way, relieved the entire family. That's one. Then there's the weird story, which I've probably told people about, to do with Noni and Domini and the plane crash. Have I told you about that one? Yeah. So one of my students named Noni, she went off around the world after she'd done the Tarot Collective. When she came back, she was riddled with cancer. And it had all metastasized. It was right through her body. And she contacted me a week before she had a body death. And she said, can you come around and read my cards, please? I said, sure. She said, just read mine. Mine are in the garage. So I turned up at the house and she was being helped out of the bath by her helper. And she didn't have a hair on her body at all. And she got into bed grinning from ear to ear. And I could only find 34 cards in the garage. And I said, that'll do. I think I can read a Kellogg's cornflakes box, because by that stage I could. So she shuffled them and I pulled out 3 cards, and the 3 cards were 8 of Wands, Ace of Pentacles, Ace of Wands. And the answer was new matter, a field of new matter. And she said, what does that mean? I said, I got no fucking idea, but that's your destiny. She went, oh, okay. So her palliative care worker helper was sitting on the floor and she had a notepad and she wrote down all the ideas that Noni had as to how Noni would contact me after she'd had a body death, so that she could say, hey, it's for real, we don't die. And in the end, she decided a chrysanthemum on fire. And so that was written down because that would have been a rarity. And we were looking for the rare as an example. She died a week later. Several months later, I met Domini. She came and she sang a cappella at a festival that I did called the Wearing of the Green Pageant. She'd been with a band called Tane. And she'd heard I read tarot, and so she ended up coming along and having a reading. In the meantime, she sang a cappella at Noni's funeral. So she got together with the guy who was ex-priest who was living in my house at the time of training with tarot, and he was living in my house to learn how to debate without getting into arguments. And they got together and they were lovers. This particular night, we ended up having a huge argument in the kitchen because she said, life is Maya, it's illusion, it's nothing. And I said, life is beautiful. I don't like what you're saying. I'm uncomfortable with it. And this went on and on and on. Steve eventually came in and said, we're going to the fucking movies or what we're doing. We're going to see Powder, which is an amazing film, by the way, if you ever get a chance to watch it. She was uptight. We got to the movies. We're in the middle of watching the movie and she grabs hold of my arm and she said, I get it. All right, 3 weeks later, she's dead. She'd gone for a reading and I know the reading now because I got the tape back. She took the place of a person who was up from Sydney who got scared shitless the last minute about getting in the light plane at Niagara. So she took her place, and the plane clipped the trees and exploded. And the person who was witness to it said it looked like a flower on fire. It actually looked like a chrysanthemum burning. Simon Sewell, who was an astrologer, brought and lived downstairs from her, brought the tape to me and said, "What's on the tape?" We put the tape in the tape deck, and the first thing it says is, "Boy, are you on fire like you wouldn't believe," and then bang you through it. Oh, sorry, it says, "Wow, if you've got a health problem, you're on fire like you wouldn't believe," and then bang you through it. That's how the reading started. On and on it goes. There's a lot I can't remember, but what I do remember is that it said there'd be a record. The tape was to go, the tape would come back to me. She was in the band, it was going to Sydney. I said, "You're going to Sydney, but you'll be in the Department of Births, Deaths and Marriages, and will you be pissed off at that?" Then she'd said, "Do I get to move to Mullum?" And I said, "You'll be buried there." In her warning spread, it said, "There's a woman who'd had 3 abortions. Don't let her have the 4th one. It'll be you." But then it kept on going, so that she ended up in Greece with this lovely man, and this whole other story started having to do with this whole other life. It said that the event would occur in the time of Gemini under a Virgo moon, which is the exact date that the plane crash happened. Her body was taken to Sydney for the autopsy before the death was registered in the Department of Births, Deaths and Marriages. The ceremony to do with her burial did take place in Mullum, and relatives came from everywhere to listen to the tape. What happened after her body death? See, did she turn a corner in a street and find herself in another country, being another person? Do you understand what I'm saying? If I answer your questions, or if I answer the questions, it would be a hypothesis based on everything, on anything that I'd learned, but it wouldn't be the truth. I would be fucking with you. Yes, you're going to know in your work. I think it's so important to be able to say, this is where the courage comes in as a seer, to be able to say it like you say it and not sugarcoat it, not make it out to be something that it's not. And not to even talk about the deceased, to talk about the dead. I have so many conversations, people will say they pass over. I say, "Can you say dead, please? Why are you so afraid of the word?" We have to come to terms with the language of death.
What does deceased mean?
No longer being, ceasing.
Oh.
So it's cease. But they're not deceased, just like they're sort of not dead. And you can't be dying. It's like the man on the bridge. You're either alive or you're dead. There's no dying. You're alive and you're sick. And then the nurse is not there. Where the nurse goes, don't know, don't care. Turns a corner, don't know, don't care. And I've even remember telling that to a man who was in my tarot collective, Andrew, his name was, and he was a mathematics professor, and he wanted to know, he had cancer, 4th stage cancer, and he wanted to know what was going to happen when he died. And I said, "I'll tell you when I get there." He said, "What kind of fucking teacher are you?" And I said, "An honest one." Because the speculation, there's even some fascinating documentation. I mean, I've forgotten more books than I've read, but I do remember reading about Saladin, great warrior, Saladin, Islamic warrior. And around the 10th, 12th century, whenever he was around, what actually happened, that was the invention of the Islamic heaven. Because according to this scholar in the Middle East that I read, and it was translated into English definitely, but the idea was that to convince a population of heaven, the introduction of a drug to a goat herd who was in his dinner, he goes to sleep. He thinks he has a dream. He wakes up, he's in this magnificent palace with these wonderfully beautiful young women, nubile young women. There's food and there's drink and there's chalices and goblets and gold plates everywhere. And when he asks the people that are there where he is, he's told that he is in X, wherever it happens to be. And then he's drugged again. He's put back with the goats. He wakes up next day and goes, "That's what X is. There's the afterlife." So he tells people, you do that enough times, you've created a story that's taken up as fact. And in my book, Witch, I wrote all about these supposed afterlives, except the Celtics don't have one. And even in Valhalla, you can go there, you can drink and eat and gorge yourself with all the warriors and fight and die that night. But then eventually you've got to sort of become alive again and actually die properly in battle. That the stories out of Egypt, the stories out of Mesopotamia, the stories from all around the world to do with what happens when you die, they're all over the place. But as Lynn Kelly says in a lot of her work, these are stories for children. But we don't have the initiations into adulthood that Indigenous cultures have got. So we're stuck with the children's stories and we're supposed to fucking believe them. And conversations like this are breaking that chain. Think for yourselves about what you've been told is fact and what you know to be speculation. And that's a beautiful thing. But the work of the seer, that's where we've got to break the chain completely. And everybody dies because they die. There doesn't have to be a reason. They can never die before time because they die when they die. Simple. Everything goes through the cycle. It's just nom. And yet, while that person, that species lives and is part of our tribal or cultural connection, how we feel collectively is super important because that's feeding future generations.